Jesus. Amen. All right, so we are continuing our sermon series called Spiritual Conversations. The main thing for this is a Lutheran Hour study that was done with Barna about why we aren't having spiritual conversations anymore. They said they're way down from what they were 30 years ago. And some of you are like, oh yeah, 30 years ago, the 60s. No. 30 years ago was the 90s. Okay, that was 30 years ago. That is what we're talking about. Is what has happened to bring this on, and we've seen how we're called to have these conversations, but there's, like last week we talked about why we're not having them, and kind of fear is what's having them. Like fear, you don't want to be a nasty person to somebody, and I get it. I don't like to be nasty person to someone else either, and it seems like that's kind of all we're left, and we have all this conflict and all these things around here. And what they saw doing their research is that there were five common myths about our spiritual conversations. And we're going to walk through those real quick. The first myth is spiritual conversations take place in special places during special moments by special people, right? Like that's the first one. You're like, oh man, like the spiritual conversation has to happen. That's got to be pastor. Got to come into his office so that they can sit in his glorious couch that he has in his office underneath the gloriousness of a pit viper racing flag on his wall. Some of you have not been in my office. I have the world's cheapest couch, and Kevin has tried to shame me by putting a pit viper racing flag on my wall so I'd finally get a nice piece of art on that thing. And so far, it has not worked. And so we have that, but it's got to be there, and he's going to have to light incense and like all this. No. The Spirit of God can work even at the end of your driveway, right? Like that's where it is. The second myth is spiritual conversations are supposed to be serious and sober events. It's like you like all gang up on a friend of yours, and they walk in. It looks like an intervention all of a sudden, and you're like, listen, bub, you have issues in your life, right? Like, no. These things contain laughter. They're real conversations with real people. Laughter is the spice of life, and it's not small talk either. Like so often, all these things seem like small talk to ourselves. It's not. Small talk, like the whole idea here is seeing that our conversations are beautiful. And they can go deeper, and we can talk about, and that's kind of what we're doing today, is talking about like even the difficult things in life. And psychologists say that deep conversations are enjoyable and work to build relationships and make our souls feel more complete, right? So the third myth is this. In a spiritual conversation, I need to be able to give all the right answers. I just got to have all the answers ready to go. Like this, I need to have an answer for everything, right? Real talk for a second. The last sermon series called Revealing True Power, that we went through the Gospel of Mark from Christmas all the way to Easter, was all about our own pride and humility, right? A lot of the times when we feel like we have to have all the right answers, this myth usually comes from a feeling of our own pride, where we want to appear knowledgeable. We want to lead the people to the right answers. Listen. The Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark, present Peter, they call him the rock because he's kind of dumb as rocks, all right? He's not the brightest person, right? And yet, at the beginning of the story of Acts, the Spirit comes upon him, and he's able to speak words of encouragement that we still are encouraged to this day, right? So if it can happen to Peter, it can happen to you. You don't have to have everything right. And it's actually freeing When you're able to have a spiritual conversation, just a conversation in general, where you don't feel like you have to have all the right answers, it's freeing. You're freed to actually just be a human being and not some robot that is like, oh, you said this, book, chapter, verse, second Hesitations 5:17. You got to say these things, right? Like no, you can have just a real conversation about hope and all of those things. In the study, they said that often, rather than crisp memorized answers, non-Christians are more interested in Christians being willing to give them space to ask their own questions and being willing to honestly and humbly journey with them towards the answers. If you've ever done a new member class here, which we're kind of promoting right now, there's a sign-up sheet on the lectern thing out there. One of the things we do is we ask, hey, where did you come from? What was your what did church look like? What's your family history and all that stuff? And we do this for one reason, because people will come in and they're like, I like traditional worship, or I like contemporary worship, or something like that. What does that mean? If I went up to you and I went, I like traditional worship. Do you know what traditional worship to me was growing up? It was singing like 90s praise songs like Shine Jesus Shine and all that stuff with screens and all of that stuff. That's traditional in my book. All right? So let's do traditional worship, right? Yeah, so that's the whole point. And when we do that thing, we realize that we all have different traditions and expectations for things. And when we realize that, the purpose of church is that as a body of Christ, we take all of us from different starting points, and we are going towards Jesus and to his cross and through it into the resurrection. And so we all have different things and beliefs and family histories and all that stuff, and we're working towards them. So it's all about that journey. Fourth myth, not the fifth one, the fourth one. The most spiritual conversations involve conflict, and conflict ruins everything, right? Like this idea, I think, gets us in this evangelism model that we've had in the past. You look at classic books like The Case for Christ, or I think James MacDonald had one that was Evidence Demands a Verdict. And all these books are like, you better know the answer it's all about winning. It's all about winning. I got to win the argument with whoever I'm talking about. Listen, if someone is obsessed with winning, they have antichrist tendencies about them, okay? Because Christ, the true Christ, came and lost, right, on the cross over there. And we see that through the cross, through that, we see life and power. That was the revelation of true power that we were talking about, right? Listen, you don't have to win in the conversation. Lose. You're just following the cross of Jesus every time you lose. It's okay. You're fine. All right? And so then number 5, spiritual conversations are burdensome duties that are in the end painful and regrettable, right? What if our conversations were just about everyday things, full of laughter, an honest journey, rather than hitting points of special doctrines, but we'd feel free to share joy and hope that we have in telling good news, right? That's what we're talking about, that our conversations are beautiful. They're beautiful whether we are talking to Christians or not. Just the act of having a conversation, whether it's about spiritual things or not, is beautiful, right? It's how we share the human experience. It's how we live as humans together. And that humanness is so deep. We can have conversations that are so important. We can have conversations about how much we all just deeply love NASCAR, right? Together. We can have conversations about how awesome it is that Formula One is in Miami this weekend. That's amazing. We can also have conversations about how we think Bud Light tastes like reclaimed sprinkler water. We can have these are known truths in the universe, right? And some of you are like, I like Bud Light. you can like reclaimed sprinkler water. That's fine. But we can also talk about heartache. And we can talk about lost love. We can puzzle together through deep questions about the universe. These conversations are beautiful because we're all looking and experiencing hope. We just happen to believe that hope comes from God, our Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. And we love to share those times in life that don't seem so beautiful. When life seems like shattered glass on the ground. Those are beautiful stories. Some of you have talked to, like, that you've had in moments of I don't know, struggle and all of that. And I always have this one thing, because I remember I had this one pastor that I was listening to one day, and he changed everything about me, because for a long time there, I tried to like, all right, a Christian life is one that is lived in perfection. Do you realize how boring perfection is? It's boring. When I take a road trip up to Atlanta to see my family, and if everything's fine, I go up to Atlanta and we come back and you hear no stories from it, that trip was boring. Nothing went wrong, right? But when I come back like this last year, and we had successfully mitigated ourselves from COVID for the last 2 years, and I go up, release my guard just a little bit, and my family's like, let's spread it all around, right? And we go up there, we're like, what in the world, right? And we get there, and Coley and I are like, we probably have COVID now, because we're getting like, you get the drainage in the back of your throat, and like my brother-in-law, sister, and everyone in my family's all got it. They've tested positive. We're like, all right, we don't want to be sick in this house. Like, we need to leave now. Like now, we've probably got 20 hours before we cannot drive anymore. Like, get in the car, load up, and go, right? Like, but that's the whole thing, is when life falls apart, when things don't work out this way, when you have a Chevy Chase style trip to Wally World, right? Like, when you have that, that's when the stories happen, right? That's when you begin to see the spice of life, when the shattered glass of your life is all around and you just share that experience and how you got through it. That then is there. And that's what's going on with Israel. Now that Isaiah chapter 52 is a beautiful verse, beautiful verse, and that whole section of Isaiah, chapter 51, 52, and 53 is beautiful, and it's all telling this narrative of these shattered lives that are made beautiful, right? These stories that we tell are beautiful here. And I encourage you this week to read chapter 51, 52, and 53. Now, this week of Isaiah. Now, you got to remember, it's not till about 500, 600 years ago that chapters and verses were put into the Bible so it'd make it easier for us to study, right? So Isaiah, when he was writing, wasn't like, ooh, chapter 53. Yes, he wasn't doing that, right? It was all kind of together. So all these ideas kind of intermingle in there. But the beautiful part of this story is that Israel is shown in Isaiah chapter 51 at the beginning of 52. Israel is shown that God is recognizing their struggle. They're talking about how everything looks bombed out and destroyed, right? They are in captivity. The Assyrians have captured them. And they're living out in misery, and there's recognition of that. So you can see this right at the beginning of chapter 52, verses 4 and 5. So 51 and 52 is this. It says, "For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing." Like, he's recognizing you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed also without money. You're not going to be redeemed by being finally worth something, right? By finally getting your act together, you're finally going to be worth something, right? For thus says the Lord, my people went down at first to Egypt to sojourn there. And we all know what happened in Egypt. They were stuck in slavery, stuck in just in awfulness, right? And the Assyrians oppressed them for nothing. Like this 51 and on into the beginning of 52 is all about the recognizing of the struggle of life, the struggle of what's going on, but then in a beautiful way, because most of Isaiah is poetry, and in a beautiful way you get to verse 7 of Isaiah 52. And he says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publish peace, who bring good news of happiness, who publish salvation, peace, who say to Zion, our God reigns. And it's almost like he's driving us into this mental picture of like, look, coming from the mountains far away, there is someone who is running. Look upon that person that is running, that he's bringing good news, and he's been running forever, kind of like when a marathon first started and they didn't have shoes on, and he's running and his feet are sore and tore up, and he's still running. You can hear him shouting, good news, as he's coming, right? As he's coming forward to there. And that good news is that God is still for them, that God is still on the throne, that it looks like everything has fallen apart, that everything is bombed out and destroyed, but God hasn't forgotten them and they have not bombed out God's throne. How beautiful are those feet that bring good news. Those feet that represent suffering to tell that message. And Isaiah begins to weave this tale and begins to tell us what those feet look like, what those feet, and they go into a section that we call the suffering servant. And it's all this expression of those feet that are all destroyed and hurting. How beautiful are those feet that are hurting who bring good news. And we just go like, 15, 16, 17 verses forward from this one, we go to Isaiah 53, and he says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. How beautiful the feet, right? All we like sheep, we've gone astray. We have turned every one of us to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That's Isaiah, that's Old Testament stuff, right? Like Isaiah gives us this beautiful picture. This picture of beautiful feet announcing that God is still king. And just a span over a few verses, just those chapters right there, we're invited into the story of shattered lives of no hope, but looking into the distance at someone running in with good news. And that one is carrying our sorrows, even when we have afflicted him, because his wounds heal us. Those shattered fragments of our lives all over the ground like broken stained glass, those fragments there become his wounds and they heal. These stories of healing for when times aren't going right, and we share them and we bring them through the hope. We share these stories with people around us and talk about them. They are like balm for us. And they're brought by beautiful feet. They're stories of good news. You know, a few of the myths that we talked about before were about worrying and having the right answers and worried about conflict. You know, when we are sitting down together with a cerveza, a Diet Coke, talking with each other about how we've gotten through those hard parts in our lives, just that act of talking about it is beautiful. Just that act. And when we're able to put aside our pride and our fear and where we don't have to feel like we have to have just a quick answer or response or try to win, we're able to have this back and forth conversation about the real things in life. I remember I remember this happening to me because I was raised on like, have all these answers. And my problem is I'm not that smart. Like, I'm not that smart. I have problems just memorizing things and all that stuff. I think that's why I struggle with names and all that stuff. And like, you're trying to memorize to have all these just quick answers for people. And this, I talk about space, like the universe and all that stuff. I talk about it all the time because space is where I ended up finding that all my little answers for things don't mean a hill of beans. Space is huge. And there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand, right? And in my own life, I was trying to understand all these things. And when I began to understand more about what's going on from with like the Hubble telescope and what this James Webb Space Telescope is going to do, oh my God, like it's going to blow our minds, right? And we can decide to get entrenched and go, no, I'm not going to believe anything that they say in that. Or we can allow it to reveal more of God's creation that we don't understand and allow it to give us conversations with people. I think this is where the Spirit of God works, much like it did with Peter, working to take the shattered bits of our lives to be like that suffering servant, like Jesus. How you can see how he helps you through those times to bring hope. It's not about proselytizing. It's just sharing what you've seen. Good news. So, this is all research stuff that we went through. I'm just going to read some of the research that they did because the research supports everything that we're saying here, and I thought this was interesting. So it says this. Christians were asked to reflect on their most recent spiritual conversation and describe what emotions they experienced during that conversation. The top 3 emotions were by far peace, joy, and exhilaration. That's roller coasters for you uninitiated, right? Peace and joy were also the top emotions reported by non-Christians when they had spiritual conversations. Interesting, huh? The majority of Christians and non-Christians reported that laughter was often involved in those spiritual conversations. Christians were asked to reflect on the last time they talked about their faith with someone who did not share their faith. And some people did report that conflict did come up in the conversation. But what's surprising is how rare it was. Less than 20% of people report any such conflict. And what's even more interesting is that the presence of conflict didn't move the needle on whether or not people were glad that they had that conversation. The overwhelming majority of Christians and non-Christians are glad that their most recent spiritual conversation happened and the presence or lack of conflict didn't matter. Fascinating. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Like so, and the way I see all this is that so often we get so concerned about having the right answers that we get all wound up in ourselves. But here's the thing. Whether or not you have a successful conversation or not, does that change? Does that mean that Jesus didn't die and rise again then? No. Jesus died and rose again. You're fine. Right? Whether you have one or not, you're fine. Jesus died. And the person you're talking to, whether it goes successful or goes south, it's fine. Jesus died and rose again already, right? Jesus is already doing all this for us. All this reminds me of the Winchester Cathedral. Winchester Cathedral and thing. This is the big stained glass window in the front of Winchester Cathedral. And you look at it and you're like, oh my goodness, this is a beautiful mosaic of this stained glass window, just beautiful all of there. But that's what it looks like at first glance. But then you read about the story that happened there. Now, during the English Civil War in the 17th century, we know that war by another name. It's called the French Revolution, type of thing. And so Oliver Cromwell was going around, marching around, taking over areas and stuff. And he came in, took over Winchester, and used the cathedral as a stable. for his horses. And while that was happening there, war is awful. We know this. And they went into the crypt, and they opened the crypt trying to plunder it for jewels and gold and stuff like that. They grabbed the bones and threw it through the stained glass windows. The big stained glass windows, I know, right? Like threw it through there. All the bones, and they used it as stained glass windows. Now, those stained glass windows were like most stained glass windows. They were like a picture telling stories from the Bible. Like we have this one, like that's stained acrylic, I think, but like it's all right. Like that. But it's like Jesus with sheep and all that stuff. But like telling stories and all that stuff. And they also they threw those bones out, and they just broke all the stained glass. And after Cromwell's army left, all the people in the town, they gathered together, and they went in there, and they picked through all the horse stuff and the hay and the lawn, and they picked up all those parts and pieces shattered all over the ground. And they began to put them together as best as they could, but they couldn't put it back together the way that it used to be. But they put it together like this. And armed with this information, you can now look at that window, and you no longer see a random mosaic, but you can look and you can see a random arm, a piece of a face, a piece of a hat, and these shattered stories being brought together, being made beautiful. And this is what God does in our spiritual conversations. And as I look out over here, I know a lot of your stories, because you've shared them with me. A lot of you I see a lot in you. I see a lot of beautiful stained glass windows that have been put back together, right? Through Jesus. Go share that beauty with the people around you. May God bless you in your spiritual conversations. Let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you love us. Lord, please be with our conversations. Let us see that when life is shattered, let us share those moments that we can live together in those ways, sharing the beauty of the broken all throughout our lives. Thank you.